Hello everyone, welcome to English 201 Introduction to Literature. As I said, I wanted to give you a video that went over the basic tenets of what we've discussed, what is literature, but also how do you critique it? How do you go about literary criticism, which, as we've said, does not mean finding fault necessarily, but it means looking at something intently with the purpose of explaining it to an audience. That's a critique of something. How does this thing work? And so the basic question you're asking in a literary critique is, what is this story saying, perhaps, or poem saying, or play saying? But even deeper and maybe more accurately, what is this story doing? Now you see the difference between that. You can explain to somebody, this is what this essay is saying. It's trying to convince you of this and this and this, and here are its reasons, right? But when you approach a story that isn't, well, even with something like Aesop's fables or something, it's not so simple as it's just trying to teach you this lesson, because the story that it chooses to teach you this lesson with is indicative of all sorts of assumptions and things like that, and it colors the way that you take the lesson or the moral of the story, right? Well, certainly more so with less moralistic literature. So we're going to take the example of Raymond Carver's Cathedral, as I said. But so the question is, what is the story doing? What you're trying to do is explain, how is this story creating the effects in its readers that we see that are there? And what are those effects in detail? Now, a number of you really began to get at some of how the story is operating. You talked about it being bland, or the language being bland on the one hand. And that creates a persona for the narrator, which again is not how one assumes, it's not how Raymond Carver spoke. It's a character with a particular voice. As we know, he was raised, Carver was in Oregon, and so it's definitely this sort of blue-collar 70s feeling sort of voice, and there's a lot of overtones there. But let's look at the end of this story real quick. We'll kind of get into it. I guess this was written in '83, but it still feels like kind of a 70s voice. We'll get into it by the idea of how to talk about literature by using a little bit of an example from this story. So the story ends with an epiphany. If you haven't read a lot of literary short stories, perhaps you kind of just blew through the ending. You're like, wait a second, what happened? They tried to draw a cathedral. Is that it? If you read closely, the tension is sort of building towards the end, or the energy is building, and then at the end, my eyes were still closed. I was in my house, I knew that, but I didn't feel like I was inside anything. It's really something, I said. And it's clear that the narrator has had some sort of epiphany or revelation, or a new entryway into reality, or something like that. But how do we get there? We're not just given this sort of, one day a man had an epiphany and suddenly realized something about life, sort of thing. We're led to this conclusion, and the way that Raymond Carver does it is skillful, and it operates at a lot of levels of our psychology. We have different feelings. If we're paying attention to the story, we should have different feelings as we go along, not just simply boredom, or whatever, but from the beginning, you should be sensing between the lines a sort of apprehension about this blind man coming. Why would you feel apprehension? Just because he's blind? No. The narrator expresses it in that way. He's kind of like, well, blind man, that's weird that he'd be coming to my house, or whatever. But it's more than that. The history we learn of the blind man is that he worked closely with the narrator's wife. And in fact, the next person that he worked closely with, he ended up marrying. So it's clear that he's a sort of confidant that perhaps a husband might very well be worried about. Like, why are you so close with this guy? And you've been writing or sending tapes back and forth with him for years, and what's his deal? And you can tell that the narrator's a little leery about his wife's, well, past husband, and these sorts of things. But there's this suspense, like, what's this blind person going to be like? They're very close, and I don't know how I feel about them coming in to my home and sleeping here, he says. Okay, and then also, why is he blind? Why, this is fiction, so anything, any detail that you find there that's pertinent was a choice made by the author. Now, you want to be careful about a purely author-based sort of criticism where you're saying, this person, Raymond Carver, decided to do this for these reasons. And the reason is that oftentimes good literature kind of transcends the author. And I'm not just saying that in a sort of wishy-washy way. I'm saying that a story or a poem, good ones, can kind of become their own whole, so that almost as soon as they're written, they no longer really belong to that author, and different connections are made, and sort of logics appear within the fabric of the story that even the author, in their conscious design and making it, didn't imagine. But anyway, so why a blind man? So I'm saying that the choice is still you can treat as intentional or relevant. So why is he blind? Does he represent perhaps a sort of other sight, for example, a sort of insight into the world that those who are seeing don't have? It seems clear that he becomes that at the end. Also, you might be aware that various characters through history and literature who were blind represented wisdom. Tiresias in Greek myth, even Homer, the author, the purported poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey, kind of the seminal works in literature in the Western Hemisphere, that he was blind. Other people, Milton became blind as he went on and he dictated his poem. The point is that oftentimes blind people or blind men who were writers are put up as these sort of figures of wisdom, or seeing something that others can't see. That might be something. Also, perhaps there might be other connections. Before I keep going, what I'm doing is thinking through, why are things the way they are? Because as you're interpreting literature, which is what critiquing it means, what you're doing is seeking for a whole, or a coherent account that holds for all the parts of the story, that explains how it does what it's doing and gives you insight into what it's attempting to mean. Okay? So, to back to his blindness. Also, and a couple of you pointed this out, very good to point it out, good detail catching, his name is given at key points and repeated, the blind man's name, Robert. What does that mean? Well, it's a very typically Scottish name. He also says at another point, I'm a Scotch man. Could be a very tenuous connection, but again, and I haven't looked it up. I bet if I did some searching in some databases for research, the fact that he's a Scotch man, the fact that his name's Robert, there might be some insight into who he is and that kind of thing. But also, very interestingly, do you remember the nickname that he calls the narrator, the first person narrator, that he doesn't really like? It's clear that the narrator doesn't really like it when he first calls him that. He calls him Bub. Now, that's a nickname, a little more common back 30 years ago when this was written. But what else is it? Perhaps. Does it sound a little bit like Bob? Bub, Bob. And what's a nickname or abbreviation for Robert? Bob. Why do I bring that up? Not because that's some knockdown, drag out, convincing argument that there's some link there, but that an author like Raymond Carver, who's paying attention to the details, wouldn't have missed that. He wouldn't have been unaware that that there's that connection. And so when you have a blind person who has the same name as yours, Bob, Bub, but perhaps inverted, you kind of start thinking through, in a story like this that's made to have these sort of links, you start thinking through, oh, is this sort of an unconscious manifestation of what the narrator needs, and he's showing up at this right time. His wife goes to sleep, and it's his wife's friend, and she's staying there. It's almost like he's every detail is chosen to bring about some evocation of something. Okay, so his wife is sleeping in between them. It's almost as if he's experiencing her memories or her dreams. That on the other side of her is his double, Bob. Again, I'm giving you an example of how one might do it, and you could argue it, and then somebody else could argue back and say, no, that's not a good interpretation. But if the connections hold, it becomes interesting, right? That what he's experiencing is this sort of epiphany at the end, that he doesn't perhaps need to be so critical of the other human connections that his wife has had, perhaps. And it's bigger than that. What it's getting to is, maybe, what it's getting to is the primacy of human connection in general. At the end, what happens after they attempt to describe and then draw together hand in hand a cathedral, something that I don't think it's supposed to be so religious in interpretation, perhaps, or at least not primarily, but they have to draw it hand in hand. And a cathedral itself, as they note in here, was something that was built by many different people in a town or whatever over several generations. Not one person could build it. And so what does the cathedral represent? That's the title of the story. Does it represent sort of the joint, I don't want to say human consciousness per se, but is he trying to get at the fact that there's some sort of connection that human beings have or can have that ought not to be shied away from, and that in fact points towards, as the last line of the story goes, points towards something or a reality that's beyond humans. And whether Carver would be open to that being a religious or theological reality or not, there's some sort of, in the connection between human beings, there's some sort of profundity. It seems clear that he's going there. And so again, I just picked out a few details that seemed pertinent, that are guiding us towards, the narrator is undergoing this change and this revelation by virtue of his wife's past friend, who's blind, coming in and actually showing the narrator himself something about himself. So, explaining these sorts of details and showing it in the text. If you were writing a paper, you wouldn't just kind of ad-lib about it, but you would write down, as so-and-so says on page 44 of, right, you would quote things and you would provide evidence for the arguments you're making. A few more notes here as we finish up. And again, I'm kind of talking it through, so I hope you're able to follow it. One reminder is that the reason that you do this, I said this at the beginning in some ways, but I want to clarify it. The reason that literature responds well to this sort of critique or delving deeply into it is that literature, I think it's safe to say, is literature by virtue of its trying to use all the potential layers of language. What do I mean by that? As I said at the beginning, it's not just what does this story say, but what is it trying to do? Is it using, or a poem perhaps, is it using the sounds of the language? Alliteration, having the same sort of consonants in a row, or assonance, using vowels, and to create a music that makes you feel a certain way that corresponds to the meaning that it's trying to convey. That's using all the potentialities of words to do something, okay? Or in a story like this, are there symbols? Does the blind person represent actually the narrator's own unrecognized subconscious and desire for connection in a grander sense to other people or something? Or does he represent the threat of other people's connections that you might be jealous of, and these sorts of things, and how one ought not to be that way, but to embrace human connection in general, whatever. And again, I could be wrong in my interpretations. The point is that you ought to be looking for these things that add up to something, right? Because at the end, they're building, they're drawing a cathedral, and he's saying, well, are you looking? The blind man is saying, are you looking? He is looking with his eyes closed, right? My eyes were still closed. I was in my house. I knew that. But I didn't feel like I was inside anything. What's he saying there? This is the last line. You ought to pay very close attention to the first and last lines, or any that stand out for some reason. He's saying, I didn't feel like I was inside anything. What's happened? He's gotten outside. What? What's he gotten outside? If he didn't feel like he's inside his home or anything, perhaps his prior conceived notions of the cathedral, well, it's like a box, he says, right? I don't want to just say he's thinking outside the box now. It's kind of cliched, but you get the point that he's entered into a bigger reality that's outside the confines of the sort of assumptions that he had before this experience, and again, this experience is taking place while he's drawing something for somebody else with their hand on his. One final thought on interpretation, just to show you that like the multitudinous sort of interpretations that a good story or whatever or piece of literature can hold. Think about this from a writer's point of view, Raymond Carver's point of view. Perhaps this is a metaphor. Cathedral is an extended metaphor for the act of writing literature in general. The blind person is his audience, and he has to put his hand on it while he's drawing. He has his eyes open to draw it first, but then this connection between author and audience, when they create something together, well, the one is blind, he's not the person writing it, and the other is creating this beautiful thing, and his hand traces his hand. There's probably some connection to the creation of art there, and that it takes both those hands. A few closing notes here. As I already said, literature ought to be using everything that language has. Sound, just the sheer sound of the words. Connotations, most words have all sorts of different overtones. In this context it can mean this, in this context it can mean this, etc. Connotations. That also means allusion. I brought up Tiresias and Homer and Milton because a blind person in literature, the more you read, often is a very allusive, A-L-L-U-S-I-V-E, alluding to other things, bringing up other connections. It's a very elusive character. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland has a blind person, it has Tiresias as a character. This is 20th century literature. Okay, so connotations, but then also even the history of the word itself, etymology, what words have meant through different points in time, or what they've meant in other great literature before, and using it now in a different sense. These are all important things to pay attention to. And then finally, I'll kind of leave it here because I don't want to make this too long. Look for cues that things are important and to be paid attention to. Anytime you're reading along something smoothly and you say to yourself, that's kind of odd, why'd they do that? In a well-written story, then you can say to yourself, that was clear that the author put that in as a sort of a road or a speed bump to jog your attention a little, like, why did he say it like that? Don't just read ahead, say to yourself, oh, that might be important, okay? And many of you did with, remember, Robert. It's repeated and it's interspersed with punctuation so that it seems smooth, but really he's repeating Robert 3 times in a row or whatever in one instance. So you ought to say to yourself, okay, this isn't just happenstance that the name is Robert, and especially because it wasn't mentioned at the beginning. This blind guy, and he keeps going, and then later, Robert, and then Bub also isn't an accident. I just made this up. I haven't read if this is anywhere. You read through, he calls him Bub 1,000,000 times. It was that first time, and he draws attention to it. You know, it's not, he doesn't let it just go just because it's slang. From the beginning when he says, I'm a Scotchman, or he says right here, Bub, I'm a Scotchman myself. That's the first time he says it. And then the narrator comments in his head, right, I said, Bub. Sure you are. I knew it. Every little bit adds up to a whole. Sure you are. I knew it. You know, there's a recognition there. Bob perhaps his alter ego or his doppelganger showing up, right? Okay, enough about that. The point is to look for those cues. When you feel like, why do you say it like that? Or you kind of get tripped up as you're reading. Or if you feel like there's a lot of emphasis on something, then you don't know why, stop or slow down and look at it, you know. So again, I have somewhat intentionally not tried to do an exhaustive reading of this story where I try to interpret into a full whole. I've given you a little or a few tidbits that show that it could be pointing to a whole that adds up to kind of a profound revelation. Like as some of you said, like I've also been thinking about this story since I read it, you know, a while back, and it comes to mind, and it reminds me of, you know, people I know or things in my life. And great literature ought to have that sort of resonant staying power that perhaps it, you know, it may or may not strike you in the forehead the first time you read it with all its meaning. But the more you unpack it, the more it kind of echoes in the things that you find to be true about your own life. And you know, and that's the mark of good literature. And I said in my email that I would talk about not just why I found it good, but why I found it riveting. And that's the basic gist, is simply that I saw from the beginning that it was aiming at these deep meanings, and also that it brought up these tensions that are so true to life. You know, he's talking about his wife's first husband, and he makes it very clear that he has no desire to really talk about that. And then he's talking about this other guy who's kind of in that same camp, you know, and there was tensions from the beginning that were so nuanced and so artfully brought about that I found myself on the edge of my seat reading it, like, how is this going to turn out? And then for it to end in such a unifying way, I found profound. At any rate, when you're writing your various papers, you'll want to think about these sorts of things. Look at the details that add up to a cohesive whole.